This is the Darwin Cenotaph, the most travelled memorial in the whole of Australia. What do I mean? Well, the original granite came from about 100 kilometres south of here. Then, in order to be made, it was taken down to Sydney, brought back here, whereupon they realised that 3 names were missing, so it went back down to Sydney again to be recarved and repolished, came back up here, by which time it had travelled more than 16,000 kilometres and was unveiled with due pomp in 1921. But this is the bit that you might not have expected. 2 names were misspelt and 2 sets of initials were wrong. Not only that, but there are 3 people on it who actually survived the war. Still, it's the thought that counts, isn't it? I'm on a cross-country pilgrimage. What were they shouting? The Anzac spirit was born on the beaches of Gallipoli, and all your wartime deeds since then have created a century of rich and fascinating history. When my walk finishes, our inspiring new community roadshow begins.
Hello, Fremantle!
Join families telling me their stories, showing off their keepsakes, sharing their memories.
Thank you very much.
From battlefields to home front, welcome to my tour of duty. This week, I'm taking my one-man invasion force to Darwin. I'll retrace a chaotic exodus.
Stories of drinkers leaving half-empty glasses of beer on the bar before disappearing.
Who was Australia's smallest fighting force?
And they made them tiny little uniforms.
And at our roadshow,
Hello, Darwin!
a Darwin school digs up a World War II mystery.
It was actually discovered by geography students from our school.
That's sure to ruffle a few feathers. Modern-day Darwin is a far cry from the isolated settlement of World War II. Back then, it was an easy target for the rampant Japanese forces, and it experienced war in a way that no other Australian city has. These days, Darwin's population comes and goes, but the old-timers can never forget the days when their small outpost was Australia's front line. Mind you, locals round here have never shied away from a stoush, and it was no different back in the days of World War I.
In 1918, Darwin was not a happy place. Because of the war effort, the country was skint. So here, there were no jobs, no investment. Everything seemed to be going to the dogs. Now, on the other side of the world, the Russians had stopped fighting and instead had turned to revolution. Could the same thing happen here? Well, yes, it could. So I'm going to the pub. Ladies and gentlemen, could I tell you about Darwin in the year 1918? It was almost on the verge of revolution, and what kicked it off was beer. And these are the 2 main characters in this story.
John Gilruth, Territory Administrator, 0 people skills, and a decidedly non-PC attitude to ethnic minorities. And playing Lenin to Gilruth's Tsar was this man, Harold Nelson, trade unionist and social agitator. Trouble had been brewing for some time when the government brought matters to a head.
They put up the price of beer. Gilruth said that it was in order to get rid of the curse of sly grog, but it wasn't at all. It was just to siphon money off the Northern Territories. And understandably, people went nuts about this, and a load of them approached Gilruth, and they approached the government and said, "We want you to drop the price of beer." And Gilruth said, "No,
The government is not inclined to do that. And as you can imagine, the Darwinians went potty. Now was the time for revolution. Now was the time to raise the red flag. Now let us go and storm Government House. Yeah! Come on! To Government House to keep the price of grog down. Hooray! Hooray! You want a beer? When do we want it? Now!
On December the 17th, 1918, 1,000 people marched through the streets to Government House. Nelson had called for a peaceful demonstration, but an effigy of Gilruth tied to a car showed that these disenchanted and presumably thirsty Bolsheviks meant business.
Okay, calm down. Calm down. Order, please. When they got to Government House, they elected a delegation and sent it in to Gilruth to say, you've got to cut the tax on booze. He said to them, look into my eyes. Do I look like the kind of man who will back down? I will back down and leave if the minister tells me to. Otherwise, I will stay put. Now, you think you've been going crazy for the last 10 minutes or so, but then you went really wild. In other cities, what would they have done? They would have set fire to the Winter Palace. They would have blown up the Houses of Parliament. What did you guys do? You pulled the lattice work off the windows and you damaged the netting around the tennis court. How appalling was that? At which point, Nelson said, OK, guys, that's it. That's fine. That's cool. You can all go home now. And they all went home, and Gilruth was trapped in Government House, and Nelson had the run of Darwin until 2 months later, the Royal Australian Navy crept in and whisked Gilruth away.
Although Administrator Gilruth was later cleared by a royal commission, his career was finished. Rebel leader Nelson, like Eureka's Peter Laylaw 63 years earlier, became a Member of Parliament, the Territory's first, in 1922. I'll drink to that.
Thank you for listening to my story, you plucky revolutionaries.
Territorians were fighting over beer because nobody expected them to fight overseas. There were so few people up here, it wasn't thought worth the effort to recruit them. But that didn't stop this man, Albert Barella. He was a Victorian who'd tried and failed to work a pastoral lease in the Territory.
In 1915, he was working at Tennant Creek, and in order to enlist, he had to walk day after day through the heat, swimming through croc-infested waters, until finally he arrived at Powell Creek.
That's 190 kilometres as the crow flies, and it's only stage one.
He then borrowed a horse to go to Catherine along bush tracks, really tough bush tracks.
Chalk up another 480k on the Barella-dometer, but there's more.
Then he took a horse-drawn coach to Pine Creek. Come on, Marco, come on!
That put another 90 bum-busting kilometres on the clock.
And finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity on the open road, or the open dirt track to be more precise, he got a train for the final leg of his journey to Darwin.
All up a journey of nearly 1,000 kilometres over about 2 months. Finally, he could enlist, right? Wrong!
Remember, there was no enlistment in Darwin. So what did he do? He set sail. He took a boat all the way round to Townsville. So by the time he signed on the dotted line, even before he put on a uniform or even thought about how to fire a machine gun, he had travelled round about 3,500 kilometres.
Why am I telling you all this? Because in 1918, at Villers-Bretonneux in France, 36-year-old Albert Barella became the oldest Australian in World War I to win a VC, when he ran through machine gun fire, took out the post and captured 30 prisoners.
If they awarded an alternative Victoria Cross for sheer bloody determination, Albert Barella should have won that one too. Barella's deeds aside, this remote part of Australia had little to do with the Great War. Some 2 decades later, though, it was a very different story. On February the 19th, 1942, Australia was attacked. This Japanese propaganda film shows one of the 2 devastating raids on Darwin, which came just an hour apart. But this wasn't their first raid.
I don't understand why the Japanese came in by air. Why didn't they use ships or subs or something like that?
Well, they had. That's the interesting thing. A month before, and most people don't know about this at all, there was a submarine attack outside the harbour. They couldn't get in because there was a big boom net across the harbour entrance. So they decided to use mines, floating mines, and to try and torpedo ships that came into the harbour. And they did that on the 20th of January, 1942.
But it didn't work.
It was a complete and absolute disaster.
Why? What happened?
One of the submarines, the I-124, attacked one of our corvettes, HMAS Deloraine. They saw the torpedo running on the surface and they turned in just enough so the torpedo missed the stern. And then they charged down the track of the torpedo. The I-124 half surfaced in front of them and we depth charged her at point blank range. And she went down in 200 feet of water and she's there today with 80 blokes on board.
Second time around, there was no mistake. About 250 people died, 20 military aircraft and 8 naval ships were destroyed. Darwin was virtually wiped out. The Japanese air attacks destroyed a vital Allied supply port and sent shockwaves across the nation.
If Gallipoli was Australia's coming of age in the international theatre of war, the bombing of Darwin was its coming of age on the domestic front. But while the rest of Australia was girding its loins, Darwin, or what was left of it, was forced to beat a hasty retreat.
There were no 2-lane highways back then, just rough dirt roads choked with people desperate to flee the city.
Stories flew thick and fast of drinkers leaving half-empty glasses of beer on the bar before disappearing, of the local territory administrator who co-opted service personnel to ferry his favourite crockery and wine store, of a soldier who was ordered to go south and didn't stop till he got to Melbourne, whereupon he was put in prison for 21 days. Whether any of those stories are true or not, I have no idea, but they certainly capture the crazy, anarchic spirit of the first days of that exodus.
Those who didn't head interstate ended up about 100 kilometres down the road at a tiny settlement called Adelaide River. Back then, it wasn't much more than a relay station for the Overland Telegraph and a railhead. In February 1942, Adelaide River's 200 or so residents had their lives turned upside down.
Overnight, it was transformed. At its height, there were 30,000 troops stationed around here. Adelaide River had become the hub of the Northern Territory's war effort.
There were airstrips, hospitals, and fields full of produce.
It's hard to believe it now, but this area is incredibly fertile. And during the war, it was crammed full of market gardens.
This wasn't just to supply food, but in particular vitamins, which were in very short supply and created innumerable problems. For instance, at one time, the chief medical officer reported that 25% of all the men in the Northern Territory's garrisons went on sick parade on the same day. Clearly, they needed tons and tons of fresh fruit and vegetables, and they got them. But only, of course, because the army could provide an almost limitless supply of free labour. This pop-up town's glory days lasted for just 3 years, but it still has one claim to fame, thanks to the Japanese. This place was actually bombed, wasn't it?
Yes, Adelaide River was bombed a couple of times, and particularly the final air raid in November 1943 when the war started to retreat to the north.
You mean the last bombing in Australia?
It was final air raid on Australia ever since, yes, so that was the final one.
So what about after the war? What happened to the place?
So everything was put up for army disposals after the war, and a lot of the materials went south, and some were used on local buildings in Adelaide River.
How many people live here now, do you reckon?
About 300.
So it's virtually the same as it was in the mid-30s?
That's right, it hasn't changed much, yes.
Hi, we're having a road show in Darwin at the end of the week. If you can join us, it would be great.
Thank you very much.
By the way, do you know what that hole is?
No.
It's a World War II story tied in with this station. The Americans had got a troop train coming all the way down from the north, and the Australians had got another troop train coming all the way up from the south. And when they got here, right opposite where you're sitting now, the two trains stopped opposite each other. And there was a degree of what they call friendly joshing, except the joshing got less and less friendly, until eventually the Americans described in loving detail how they would greet the Aussies' girlfriends when they got down south, at which point shots rang out, and the net result was this, which is, of course, a bullet hole, or at least it is according to local stories. So next time a troop train passes by here, when you're sitting having a scone, you'll know what to do, won't you?
Duck.
Exactly. Well, we hope you come on Sunday.
Thank you for your Thank you.
Thank you. It's more than 70 years since the Japanese bombing of Darwin, but it's a story that still holds a few surprises. I've come to the National Trust's Burnett House to meet someone with vivid memories of that time. I'd always thought that the Darwin bombings came as a complete surprise, but you were evacuated before that, weren't you?
Oh, yes. There'd been a warning about the bombings, but nobody quite believed all this. And when Singapore fell, then the alarm bells rang.
When the government ordered all women and children to be evacuated, Wendy's mother Poppy refused to go, despite her husband's pleadings.
In the middle of the argument, there was a loud banging on the door, and a huge military policeman was standing there. And he said, "Mrs. Secret, you must leave. You've got to be evacuated immediately." She said, "No, I'm not going." And he said to her, "If you don't leave, I'll be putting you over my shoulder and carrying you down to the wharf."
Discretion and modesty prevailed. Poppy had just minutes to pack and walk her children to a waiting ship.
She rushed off down below deck, and she'd seen an empty cabin full of boxes. She got to that cabin, threw the boxes out, took us all down, pushed it in with another family, and there we did.
What a brilliant mum. During the 9-day trip to Perth, Poppy was given 2 jobs, minding her children and scanning the surrounding waters for deadly mines. What facilities did the government provide you with when you got to Perth?
Very little. So we started to find accommodation elsewhere.
You were like refugees in your own country, really, weren't you?
That's exactly what it was. And it was a very unforgettable experience, and it stayed with me all my life.
With no government assistance, Wendy's family spent nearly 2 nomadic years moving from house to house and town to town, living in single rooms, on verandas, even a deserted butcher's shop.
And finally, we ended up in Bunbury. And it was there that my mother made the decision that she wasn't going to stay there any longer, and she was going to get back to Darwin.
And eventually you got back...
When they were finally reunited with Dad in 1945, Wendy's family moved into one of these built-for-Darwin Benny Burnett houses. Not a beautifully preserved, open to the breezes, roomy one like this, but a derelict, run-down shadow of its former self.
In many ways, it must have been quite fun for a kid, though.
My brother and I, who were almost like twins, we had a bike each, and off we went on our bikes exploring. And one of the things we did find was ammunition dumps. And so we started to work out how to tap the bullets and get the cordite out. So my brother brought a stick of cordite home and put it in my father's cigarette.
You're joking?
No, and fortunately, he must have seen there was something wrong with the cigarette, and when he realised what it was, it didn't blow up, but he blew up.
But there must have been some serious consequences for some kids.
Yes, one of our friends actually blew his hand off or very badly injured because he went one step further with a hand grenade.
Their roving days were done. Wendy and her brother went back to school, and for the next 2 years, everyone got on with the job of rebuilding Darwin.
And people really were delighted to be back home.
I'm glad they've done up this old Burnett-style house, just like the one that Wendy and her family lived in when they were trying to pick up the pieces after the Second World War. But what the war didn't take away, Cyclone Tracy and newer regulations about asbestos did, because there are hardly any of these left now. And I think that's really sad, not just because they're so evocative of the war period, but also because they're some of the most good-looking and environmentally appropriate houses in the whole of Australia. I wouldn't mind living in one.
I reckon you can always judge the strength of a community by how it bounces back. And I'm not just talking people. In 1942, Darwin was home to a plucky little gunner who never fired a shot in anger, but still saved his fair share of lives.
Excuse me. Is your dog a Kelpie?
Yes, he is.
I thought so. What's his name?
He's Pacey.
My name's Tony Robinson, and I'm doing a Tour of Duty roadshow at the end of the week.
Oh,
What's your name, by the way?
Therese.
How do you do? We've got this great story about a Kelpie. Can I share it with you?
Yeah, sure.
OK. There was this Kelpie called Gunner, and he got bombed to pieces in one of the early Darwin attacks. And a bloke found him, an aircraftsman called Percy Westcott, and obviously he wanted to help him. So he was able to take him to the MO, and he was cured. But what was really intriguing about him was that after that bomb attack, he would always predict when enemy bomb attacks were about to happen. About 20 minutes before, he would start to whimper and whine and make a fuss. And he got more and more sophisticated at it, till by the end, 40 minutes before an attack came, he was able to tell people that it was about to happen.
Oh.
Knowing what you know about Kelpies, do you find it plausible that Gunner could have been able to do that?
Oh, absolutely. They're amazingly intelligent animals. In fact, Pacey here is, he always warns us when there's storms approaching.
You're joking.
No. When he was young,
Yeah.
there was a lightning strike down the back of our rural block. Scared him, he ran away. Every time a storm hit after that, he'd always let us know by his tail
That's very similar to Gunner, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Poor old Gunner. We don't know what happened to him because eventually Percy Westcott left Darwin and he was handed over to someone else and disappeared into the mists of history. But he'd clearly done a very good job. Just like this one has. Well done, you. It's a bit of a TV star. So maybe we'll see you on Sunday at our Roadshow Day?
That'd be great. Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye. It takes a lot to top an air raid warning dog, I'll grant you. But Darwin, in fact the whole of the Northern Territory, isn't your average piece of Australia. There's an unorthodoxy which is both endearing and wildly unpredictable. Exactly the sort of place that would have appealed to a guy like Donald Thompson. Donald Thompson OBE, who was he? Well, may you ask. Well, he was the leader of one of Australia's strangest fighting forces in the whole of World War II. A bunch of guys whose weapons weren't guns and flamethrowers and tanks, but spears and knowledge. Knowledge of the wild and inhospitable coastline that makes up so much of this part of northern Australia. Officially, they were known as the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, but it's a name that would have meant nothing to this small band of Indigenous men. There were only 50 men in Thompson's unit, but between them, they had thousands and thousands of years of knowing. They didn't speak any English and had had virtually no prior contact with white blokes. They were members of the Yorna Nation, the Indigenous people of Arnhem Land. Thompson, the anthropologist, had lived and worked among them in the 20s and 30s. In the 40s, Thompson, the Air Force squadron leader, decided they would be the ideal guardians of the isolated but strategically critical territory coastline. Don, why do you think that the local people trusted Thompson sufficiently to go off with him? I would have thought they would have been very suspicious.
He employed a man called Rawalla, and Rawalla trusted him. And I think Thompson trusted him also.
Had they had issues with the Japanese?
There were some issues. Throughout history, there was a large Japanese pearling fleet, and Aboriginal people made up a large component of their workforce. And sometimes there were disputes, and sometimes people settled their disputes with a rifle or a spear.
So why do you think it was that the Aboriginal people were prepared to fight?
They knew that Australia was now at war and Australia needed their help. Thompson was asking them for a service, and that service would be reconnaissance of our coastline. And these men could do it like no other.
What was it exactly that Thompson wanted them to do?
He wanted them to be stationed along our coastline. He wanted them to watch 24 hours, every ship, every aircraft, every light, and report it. And so he set them up right along our coastline. He had a small boat and he travelled up and down our coastline and he took reports of them. And so those reports were relayed back to Darwin on any activity on a large part of our northwestern coastline of the Northern Territory.
Every week, each man received 2 sticks of tobacco, some flour, tea and sugar. They were expected to live off the land and, in the event of a Japanese invasion, to fight a guerrilla war. How long did they have to stay out there?
Approximately 3 years.
So they were away from home all that time?
Yeah, although they were in their own land, they had to stay on that beach. They weren't allowed to walk off and leave their duty post. And those men served every day, no holidays. Those men, many had wives, and some of those men went home and their wives were no longer there because they had married again, you know.
What happened to them after the war?
They went back to their families, and some of them, their families were intact, some weren't. These men, again, weren't compensated for their services to their country.
In 1945, Donald Thompson was awarded an OBE for his services. In 1992, the few surviving members of the NTSRU were given campaign medals and 3 years back pay on private's wages. It would be easy to put that story down as another chapter in the turbulent history of Indigenous race relations. But I'm pleased to say that the legacy of the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit lives on today.
Eight and 10!
Larrakia Army Base is home to Norforce, a unit based here in Darwin. Today, the latest intake of Norforce cadets is having its passing out parade. Many of them are young Indigenous men and women still searching for a career path.
The patch that's been put on your shoulder today represents a significant history of a unit that has been involved in protecting country and serving the nation since the Second World War. Congratulations. Welcome to the unit. Good work.
Those who don't pursue an army career will be encouraged to go back and serve their remote communities.
They've only had a fortnight's training, Matt.
That's right. They've come a long way in only just over 2 weeks. And,
I'm very impressed. I was on Blackadder for 4 years and I couldn't do all that marching stuff that way.
That's right.
But this is specifically Northern Territory people who are looking after protecting the Northern Territory.
Exactly right. They have intimate knowledge of the land, and especially the Indigenous guys, they feel a real connection to the country that they wish to always serve and look after.
They'll be the guardians of the same remote areas as those Yolna men of the NTSRU were some 7 decades before them. This is my first visit to Darwin, and I'll be honest, I thought the war history here would start and end with the Japanese bombing in 1942. Clearly I couldn't have been more wrong, which has been a lovely surprise. But then Darwin is full of them.
Ladies and gentlemen, hi. Hello. I wanted to ask you a question. Have you any idea what the most effective means of all was for the Australian Army to communicate in New Guinea in the Second World War? What might you think? Yeah.
How about jungle drums?
Jungle drums, yeah. There's a problem with jungle drums, though, isn't there? Is that the enemy can hear them and...
Smoke signals.
Smoke signals, yeah, very good. These are all very old-fashioned.
What about Morse code?
Morse code, yeah. The problem with most of the electronic things in those times were that they did tend to rely on lines, and lines could easily be cut. I will tell you what the answer is, and it really is quite weird. It was one of the most effective collaborations in the entire Second World War when the Australian Army met up with some groups of pigeon fanciers and they formed the 7th Australian Pigeon Unit. It's absolutely true. And they made them tiny little uniforms, tiny little hats. No, that's not true. That's not true. She's going, oh, right, little uniform. I could do that. No, that bit isn't true. Or everything up until the little uniforms was true, though. And what's also true is that they had to train them, especially when they brought them up here, because mostly these weren't tropical birds, and so they would get knackered really easily, and they'd get wing cramp. They had to identify which were the best flyers, and apparently the ones with black wings, the feathers didn't fray in the same way as they did for the light wings. She thinks I'm winding her up. This is absolutely true.
But here's the best bit. In 1943, a fabulous woman called Maria Dickin created the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, which she modestly called the Dickin Medal. And 2 Aussie pigeons won it.
One was called Blue Bar Cock Pigeon number 139DD43T. You'd have thought they might have called it Joey or something.
Call him Blue.
Call him Blue. That one won for flying through a tropical storm and helping to rescue a foundering army boat. And another one, Blue Checker Cock Pigeon number 879DD43Q, for flying through heavy enemy fire in aid of a stranded patrol. So they did do a good job, didn't they? And remarkably, you can still pay homage to these birds because they are still around. They are at the War Memorial in Canberra
where they've been stuffed. Just like I have by the fact that there are no pigeons here. What? Hey, no. Zach, look. I knew we'd find one. Fortunately, I'm not counting on pigeons to turn up to our tour of duty at the Military Museum, but I do want lots of people and lots of stories of when the Northern Territory went to war, at home and overseas. Come on, Darwin, surprise me yet again. I'm just lurking around the back of the Military Museum for a few moments, trying to keep cool before we start the roadshow. I'm really looking forward to this one because Darwin has got such fantastic military history. A lot of it I didn't know about, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other people didn't know about it either. For instance, OK, I knew it had been bombed in the Second World War, but not that this area had sustained 64 air attacks, or that the Japanese had got as far as Catherine, which is a couple of 100 kilometres inland. Some people say that the Second World War is when the enemy arrived at Australia's doorstep. No, it wasn't. It was when it went over the doorstep and into the hall. I think you can only really understand the strategic importance of this part of Australia today if you know its military history. So I reckon it's that important, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all the stories and looking at all the memorabilia. Let's get on with it. Hello, Darwin! Do you know, it's great to be here. Your city, to me, is always like a phoenix rising from the ashes. The Japanese smashed the city in 1942. Cyclone Tracy hammered it in 74. You got up again, and all this week I've been wandering around your pubs, taking the mickey out of passers-by, generally making a nuisance of myself. And you got up again. Your houses may get smashed, your city may get smashed, but always you've got your history, and I can see it still being passed on, maintained by men like you, by women like you, by big scary birds like that one. So we genuinely thank you for coming. And when I say we, it's not just me here today. I'm sharing my task, come forward, Craig, with Craig Stockings from the University of New South Wales, Canberra. What are you going to be looking for today? What could make you excited?
Well, Tony, I'm hoping we can unearth some stories, not just about the battlefield, but also about the home front at the same time. But either way, I'm excited. I can't wait to start.
Yeah. Oh, let's give him another round of applause. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, that's enough jabbering from you and I. Let's get on with the road show. Robbo, I was driving through here looking, I thought, the spitting image of General MacArthur, and suddenly I'm totally upstaged by this massive bird of prey. What's the story?
Courage is a 26-year-old wedge-tailed eagle. He's the mascot of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Darwin. His birthday is the 27th in August. He's a Warrant Officer Class 2, as by the rank slide that I've got here on the glove. He's been with us for the 26 years. We got him from Taronga Park Zoo as a 3-week-old chick.
Am I right in saying that he's been a bit of a bad lad in the past?
Courage has quite a few discrepancies to his name. His major one was assaulting the Chief of the Defence Force at the time, Peter Cosgrove. He has known to rip his epaulette off his shoulder.
So what happened to him? How was he punished?
He got demoted, and it was one of the times that he's gone up through the rank structures from corporal to sergeant to corporal to trooper to work his way back up through again.
What else has he done?
There's been times that he's gone AWOL for up to 3 days, that he's flown off the parade, gone into the local training there, and it's taken 300 people 3 days to try and locate and find him. Just recently, he had a real run-in with military police that he assaulted half a dozen of them. So
What's the way? Yes, that's you we're talking about. Oh, cheers, guys. Mind you, when we were having that conversation all the time, Courage was going, actually, can you get the camera back on me now, please? Nice name, by the way, Robert.
Thank you.
Hello, Alice. I understand you brought in for us to have a look at something from, of all places, the Gallipoli Peninsula.
Yes, yeah.
What might that be?
I've got this shell. It belonged to my great-grandfather. He was in the 2nd Field Ambulance. Yeah, the rumour is it came through his tent, which I don't really believe.
OK. This is actually a fascinating find. What we've got here is the fuse of a shrapnel shell. So not the explosive bit, the bit that sits on the very front. And if I turn this over and have a look, there's a figure here of a number 6. You know what that means to us? That means, and this is interesting, this was a British shell. Now, Gallipoli, the front lines were very close. We're talking about old technology. It's still 1915. It's every possibility, or is a possibility, that this was a mistake. It landed where it shouldn't have landed. Or perhaps it did land where it was supposed to land, got shot right up in the air and landed back down in his tent, something like that. But we can say, for someone in the field ambulance, should not be receiving this sort of fuel on a shell. So a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Alice. This is a real find. I hope that background makes the story deeper for you.
Thank you.
I'm in the top end, taking my tour of duty to Darwin. It's hot, it's steamy, but the military museum is still full of people keen to share their stories.
Excuse me?
Yeah,
Craig, another little find. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Can I introduce you to Kitty, who's brought some magnificent material for us today.
What is this stuff, Kitty?
These are pieces of embroidery that my grandmother made during her internment in a Japanese prison camp.
Wow.
So let me get a bit of background here, Kitty. What we're actually talking about here is a harrowing experience for Dutch and other European internees on what was the East Indies. 100,000 Europeans were interned at the time. Around 30,000 never came back. This is a real story of endurance. And a message like Carpe Diem to me represents exactly that.
Carpe Diem, seize the days?
Yes, and that was the motto for her, and which she pushed on other people to try and survive the camp conditions.
Really optimistic.
Yes.
How on earth did she make these things?
Well, this piece was made from a piece of curtain material. They didn't have much, so they would pull bits of clothing apart or recycle materials and recycle threads.
And we've got something here about babies, is that right?
Yes. What the women did, especially the ones who had babies and young children, they would nominate a friend to be a foster mother if they got sick or if they died.
And we have one other piece here, if you allow me to unravel, which is an apron, isn't it, Kitty?
Yes, it is.
Who are all these people and what's their significance?
The people at the top were in the first camp with my mother and her grandmother, and these were some of the other people who were still alive at the time when she was making this. And then my grandmother embroidered them.
Kitty, there's one here that's sketched but not embroidered. Why is that?
Because she had died.
Passed away before it could be done. In fact, I believe it was an illness in one of these camps that killed your grandmother,
Yes.
Is that right, Kitty?
Yes, she died of beriberi 10 days before the war ended.
So what I like about this story is, again, it reminds us that it's not just the soldiers on the front line. And for the experience of these women and these internees is right up there as a tale of endurance.
Incredible story, isn't it? Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you. Bob, your family have been here for quite a long time, haven't they?
Yes, I'm a fourth-generation Territorian. My grandparents came here in about 1887, and my father was responsible for all the gun emplacements you see around here in Darwin.
And you saw a little bit of action yourself, didn't you?
Yes, I was in Vietnam. I was with 17 construction workshops. We're a land clearing engineer battalion, and our job was to look after land clearing up the Mekong River.
Now, when you were in Vietnam, you got a very interesting piece of memorabilia, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I was billeted with a Staff Sergeant Rejo, who happened to be one of the tunnel rats.
Can you explain to these guys what the tunnel rats were?
Yeah, a tunnel rat was one of those people that had to go down, like in the Viet Cong had put all these massive tunnel networks in South Vietnam and across the country to hide in. And the job of the tunnel rats was to go down and clear them, and by clearing them was to mean to get anything that was dangerous in there out or blow them up. Anyway, this bloke that I befriended, his name was Pedro Rejo, and he looked after me and took me into a couple of the tunnels in Cu Chi. And the night we left, he presented me with his lighter, which says, like, hey, there's his tours of duty, 68, 69, 70. And it says, fighters by day, lovers by night, and drunkards by choice. And there's an apt description on the back by his name as well.
On the back, it says, when I die, bury me face down, so the whole world can kiss my ass. What a nice thought to share with you all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Give it back to him, though. Yeah. See you all.
Thank you.
Do you like this hat? The 1st Brigade gave me that. I think I'm possibly a member of the Australian Army now. Oh, what have you got?
Hello.
Hi.
Well, this is a 7-pound fragment from a 1,000-pound bomb that exploded at the Darwin post office on the 19th of February, 1942.
That's a real piece of history, isn't it?
It is. It's only 7 pounds, but you can imagine the damage that would be done by it. When it hit directly on top of a trench where 10 post office employees were taking shelter, and they were killed instantly. So.
Fantastic piece of history, isn't it? Oh, what have you got?
Well, we've got a World War II rifle here, and it was actually discovered by a few geography students from our school.
Yeah.
It was discovered in between Mindle Beach Markets and Bullacky Hill, where our school now stands, and it was actually found in the pneumatophores of the mangroves there.
Is it Australian?
Some further research by the Australian Military Museums found that it was actually a Canadian rifle.
Now, that is intriguing. There must have been loads of weapons from all over the place around Darwin at that time, mustn't there? Great stories. That is astonishing, isn't it? A picture you don't see often. Well, the sun's really been hammering down today, hasn't it? Like only Darwin's sun can, but it hasn't put us off, has it? No! Have you had a good time? Yes! I reckon that Darwin is one of the great historic cities of the Southern Hemisphere. But a lot of folk just don't get that, do they? No. Hopefully this afternoon we'll have done our little bit to spread the word. So thank you very much. Thank you. Some water. Have some water. The proud little Victorian town of Ballarat, just west of the Great Dividing Range, is small but splendid. These grand buildings were paid for by the gold rush of the 1850s. And when you walk up the main drag, it doesn't take long to understand this community loves to pay homage to its military superstars. Right at the top of their most revered is this dashing chap. Hi. You know who that is?
No, not really.
Really? Not at all? No. Really not?
No, really.
You know who it is, don't you?
He's a soldier.
He is a soldier.
A World War I soldier.
A World War I soldier, correct. This is Pompey Elliot, Harold Edward Pompey Elliot. He loathed the nickname, but it stuck with him till the end of his life. The great Pompey is often regarded as one of Australia's most famous fighting generals. From Gallipoli to the Western Front, he was renowned for his bravery and his eccentricity. This is 1918. He's up the front, as he always was, and he's telling his men what to do when, wham, he gets shot in the bum. And the other officer saying, go back, you've got to receive attention. And he was saying, no, I've got to stay at my post, that's my responsibility. And they said, well, you've got to receive some medication. And so he just stood there on his little hillock, holding his maps out, directing all his men, while the medic, excuse me, attended to his bottom. And thanks to your fantastic doctoring skills, he managed to survive the war. And he was also a bit of a showman. He'd got this horse, black horse, called Darky, and he used to trot along on the horse in front of his men. And if the horse saw anyone who he thought was a bit scruffy, the old horse would go over to them, rear up, his ears would be going back and forth, he'd bare his teeth, go like this. And now, of course, it was Pompey who was a brilliant horseman who trained him to do that. But for years afterwards, the men genuinely thought that the horse had noticed something that was wrong, but that was the kind of legend that he created. It's impossible to overemphasize how popular this guy was with his men. They would follow him anywhere. He was known to burst into tears. If he lost a lot of men, great big bear of a man, he would be crying.
At the Battle of Fromelles in July 1916, Australia suffered 5,500 casualties, 1/3 of them from Pompey's 15th Brigade. His fury at the perceived tactical disaster was only matched by his abject despair for the fate of his men. After the war, the popular Brigadier General turned senator and fought tirelessly for his beloved returned troops. Sadly, the mysterious demon that was post-traumatic stress syndrome was lurking. On March 23, 1931, one of Australia's bravest and most loved soldiers took his own life, aged just 52.
Such a high achiever, and yet with this deep sadness inside him. Having said that, for years afterwards, if ever a little boy had the surname Elliot, he tended to get the nickname Pompey in memory of that man. Lovely story, isn't it?
Ballarat prides itself on honouring its fighting men. I mean, this beautiful avenue of honour with more than 3,700 trees was created right here. It was the envy of the nation, and to this day it remains the benchmark. But I'm just as interested in the driving force behind this magnificent obsession.
Eleanor Lucas was a local widow, and in the year 1888, she set up a small sewing business at her house, just in a 7-by-6 metre room with her daughters. And it grew until eventually there were 20 women working there, and then they got a factory until finally there were 500 women sewing women's dresses, children's clothes, that kind of thing.
Eleanor's girls were like family, and she was keen to imbue them with the sense of Ballarat community spirit.
And they decided that they wanted to build an avenue of remembrance, a long line of trees, in order to recognise the service of men and women locally in the First World War. And so the Lucas girls started taking their weekends off, and they bought trees and they dug the holes and they planted the trees until eventually there was this gorgeous 22-kilometre long line of trees that they had created. But then they decided to go even grander.
Part 2 of their outrageously ambitious plan, an Arch of Victory. Cost more than £2,000. That's about $130,000 in today's money. Once again, the Lucas ladies girded their dainty fundraising loins. I'm guessing it took a mountain of homemade cakes to raise that kind of dosh, but they did it. The arch was officially opened on June the 2nd, 1920.
It was a gloomy, overcast day, but anyone who was anyone in Ballarat turned up. All the official dignitaries and politicians, all 500 Lucas girls, and the special guest over from the UK, Prince Edward, the one who became King Edward VIII and then abdicated because of his affair with Mrs. Simpson. Everyone was waiting for him to cut the official ribbon. What could possibly go wrong?
My great-grandmother, Eleanor Lucas, presented the Prince with these beautiful gold-plated scissors from a great box.
In order to cut the ribbon?
In order to cut the ribbon.
Yeah.
He went across and tried to cut the ribbon and it wouldn't cut.
Can you imagine how everybody must have felt at that moment?
There was a great scene of embarrassment and tension and whatever else, but my grandfather happened to put his hand inside his pocket and produce a pair of scissors.
And did they work?
They worked beautifully.
More than 90 years later, the opening of the refurbished arch was performed with a touch of historical déjà vu.
It was done by the Governor-General, and it was thought that she could use the same scissors.
There you are, they've done their job twice. Good pair of scissors. Better than those gold ones.
Yeah, that's right.
The Lucas factory closed in the late 1960s, but that wasn't the end of the Lucas ladies. Your spirit lingers on, doesn't it, ladies? You meet, what, once a month?
We do, yes.
And you still raise money for the arch and the trees?
Yes, yes.
And you still think that you were better than all the other girls in the other factories?
Of course yes.
What did they call you?
Oh, they called us young ladies.
And were you young ladies?
Oh, of course, yeah.
And this is your in-house magazine?
Yes.
Very posh. I don't think you look like that. Is that you?
That's me.
She was a bit of a looker, wasn't she? Gorgeous girl.
Actually, she was Miss Mardi Gras.
She was what?
Miss Mardi Gras.
What did that mean? Were you?
I was.
How did that come about?
Oh, it was easy. Well, with those looks, how could you go wrong?
Did you enjoy working at Lucas?
Yes, yes.
Do you think that's why you continue to meet up?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
All this yummy food isn't just for my benefit. Sales of the Lucas Ladies recipe book still raise thousands of dollars for the upkeep of their beloved Avenue and Arch of Honour.
So can I take one of these? Yes. Thank you very much. Let's have a go. Very nice. Well, nice to meet you all anyway. Bye.
See you later.
Oh, by the way, Saturday, 12:30, the Tour of Duty roadshow, big history roadshow at the ex-POW Memorial, you know, in the park, Botanical Gardens. If you can be there, it would be really nice to see you there. And if you want to bring some cherry slices as well, that would be great.
I've still got a history programme to present, not to mention a waistline to protect. So it's back on the road for me. I'm heading across town to a humble little suburb called Golden Point. This unassuming weatherboard doesn't look much right now, but it was once home to a rolled gold bona fide Australian hero. His name was Bill Dunstan. And he'd been in combat for less than a week when he won the ultimate accolade for bravery at the legendary Battle of Lone Pine.
In August 1915, Bill arrived in Gallipoli, which was an absolute hellhole at that time. And there was this trench that the 7th Battalion had just taken that the Turks wanted back. And it was Bill's job, along with 9 other men, to make sure they didn't.
One trench doesn't sound that important, but in Gallipoli, actually the entire war, taking even the smallest patch of ground could mean the difference between victory and defeat.
The Turks were lobbing in these bombs which would fall into the trench, and the Australians would pick them up and chuck them back. And one of them went off too soon, and an Australian guy lost both of his hands. And the Turks were firing in bullet after bullet after bullet, and more men were dying until there were just 3 of them left. Corporal Burton, the lieutenant in charge, Lieutenant Tubb, and Bill. And then another bomb came in. Woof! It went, and Burton died, and Bill temporarily lost his sight, and the lieutenant was OK. But they'd done their job. The Turks retreated, and the Aussies still had possession of the trench. And for that action, 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded, and 1 went to Bill.
When the shy 21-year-old was presented with his VC on the steps of Melbourne's Parliament House in front of a massive crowd, he was mobbed. Bill told friends later that it was far scarier than being in the trenches.
Kate.
Tony.
Bill was actually your granddad, wasn't he?
He was.
How does it feel being in the place where he grew up?
It's quite moving, really. It's been family legend for decades.
And this is where he met your grandma?
It is.
At one stage, it looked like they wouldn't be able to get married because there was opposition to the engagement.
The Dunstans were good people, but they were working-class people. And Bill's father was the local bootmaker, and Marjorie's father was the sales manager at one of the big businesses in town, Farmers Hams and Bacon. Family legend has it that Marjorie's mother said to William, "You can marry her if you win a VC." And
which wouldn't have seemed very likely at that time.
Not very likely at all. And even so, when she was walking down the street one day and the local newsboys was calling out, "Ballarat boy wins VC," and she turned to her friend and said, "Wouldn't be anybody I'd know."
Not bad for a Ballarat boy from the wrong side of the tracks.
Exactly.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
But even a VC winner wasn't immune from the pro-war lobby of the time. Incredibly, when Bill was recuperating from his wounds back home in Ballarat and was presumably out of uniform, an overzealous woman handed him a white feather of cowardice.
I've always hated this notion of white feathers, this idea that someone's got the moral right to come up to you in the street and brand you as a coward. It was something that I know was prevalent in the UK in the First World War, but I certainly hadn't been aware that it was something that went on in Australia. In fact, the problem got so bad that eventually anyone who was part of the war effort but didn't have to wear a uniform for whatever reason could get a government-issued badge that said King and Country on it to show that they supported the fighting men.
My tour of duty has taken me to the Victorian country town of Ballarat, one of the few Australian towns to be invaded in World War II. That's right, invaded in 1942.
Imagine what it was like here at the time. Small, provincial town, less than 40,000 people, not much money around, there was rationing. Most of the young men had gone away to fight in the war. There was a threat from the Japanese, and suddenly there were thousands of foreign soldiers marching through town. The Americans had arrived, wave after wave of them.
To be fair, they were arriving right across Australia for much-needed rest and recreation. Ballarat really loved them. The locals welcomed all 16,000 US soldiers with open arms, open slather and open spaces.
I'm in Victoria Park, just outside the centre of Ballarat. It's a lovely day. There's hardly anybody about at all. Certainly wouldn't have been like this in January 1943. It would have looked like this, because this is where the final wave of American soldiers, 5,800 of them, set up camp, and their presence transformed Ballarat. These weren't wet behind the ears young rookies from Ohio and Idaho. They were battle-hardened Marines who'd just been fighting in some of the most terrible battles of the entire Second World War in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. They all had terrible injuries or malaria or malnutrition. And the people of Ballarat took them to their hearts. They fed them, they cosseted them, they wrote to their mums and dads and said, "It's all right, your little boy is fine." One of the Marines said, "It was as though we'd been through hell and now we were in heaven."
Ballarat's country air revitalised the Marines, and the Marines' army money revitalised Ballarat. The local lovelies weren't complaining either. They were too busy being swept off their feet.
Oh, Tony, how lovely to see you.
Time for a cup of tea and a chat with one of those lovelies.
Shall I do the tea?
Oh, yes, that's a good idea.
What was your reaction when you first saw all these gorgeous young men?
Oh, look, it was just like as they come out of space, you know, all these men, you know, so many of them, you know, all looking immaculate, of course.
In uniform?
And in uniform, yes.
Should we take this through?
Yeah. Oh, yes, what a good idea.
And they had money too, didn't they?
Oh, yes, yes, the town benefited from that.
How did the young men behave when they came to visit?
Oh, look, they were just fun to be with. They really were.
What kind of things did you do together?
We used to get in Auntie's lounge room singing all these hit tunes and dancing in her lounge room.
Because you were a bit of a singer too, weren't you?
Oh, my war effort was concert parties. Going round entertaining the troops.
Did you go out with any of them?
Oh, yes, I had Sam, my boyfriend. He was my boyfriend for, you know, several months.
So was it a very innocent relationship, or did it used to get a bit hot?
Didn't sleep with your boyfriend in those days. So mothers organised quick weddings.
Here comes the bride. 10,000 times down under American servicemen have married Australian girls. Our soldiers came, these gals saw, and love conquered.
The brash Americans didn't always endear themselves to Australians. Overpaid, oversexed and over here was one description, but Ballarat embraced everything they had to offer.
Oh, yes, they had lots of money. You know, we had 4 picture theatres going every night of the week, and the dance halls were full, packed with them.
Did the mums make a bit of money out of them?
Oh, yes. So many of the women of the town took in the laundry, and I had a cousin that paid off her home out of the money she earned from the Americans. Yes.
These US Marines had arrived overnight, and 8 months later, they left the same way. Just like that. Gone.
Town went very silent and quiet.
And were you broken-hearted?
Well, we were sad because we missed them, because the company was wonderful.
Did you miss Sam?
Yes, I did. Yes, he was good company. He was fun to be with. He was only 19.
Were you in love with him a bit?
Yeah, I was. Well, you know, you are at 17 and a half, aren't you? You know, you think they're gorgeous at that age.
In many ways, they were very innocent days, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Very innocent days, yes. Yes, and we were all so young, you know, so terribly young.
It's people's memories that bring history to life, isn't it? Never mind the dates and the generals and the kings and queens. When Lorna told me about falling in love with Sam when she was 17 and a half, I knew what life was like in Ballarat in 1943. Clearly, Ballarat has plenty of reasons to celebrate the positives that come out of war. Heroes are born, monuments are admired, and relationships are forged. Head out of town about 15 minutes along the shores of beautiful Lake Wendouree, and you'll find a reminder of a much darker side of Australia's war history just nearby in the Botanical Gardens. This simple, elegant structure is the Australian Ex-Prisoners of War Memorial honouring POWs throughout the 20th century. More than 36,000 names are etched in this stone. 1 in 4 of them died in captivity. And in Australia, the worst memories were born in the Japanese POW camps of World War II.
The 8th Division fought in the British forces in Malaya, but Japanese jungle tactics drove them back until they reached bombed and helpless Singapore. Then surrender. 16,000 Australians were taken prisoner.
I know we tend to think that Japanese prisoner of war camps were worse than any other, but was that really the case, do you think?
I think to have been a POW during the Second World War, you were unlucky, but to be a Japanese POW, you were extraordinarily unlucky. And it was a brutal and degrading experience for everyone who was in it. If you were in a German camp, there were about 8,000 Australians in German camps, 3% of them died. In Japanese camps, 36% died.
What do you put that down to?
The Japanese were extraordinarily cruel captors. They didn't care about prisoners. They thought being a prisoner was shameful. So they were very scant with their food, with their medical supplies. They forced hard labour on most of the prisoners. There was frequent beatings, there was torture. But most prisoners died of starvation and disease.
What could the doctors do? Did they have medicines?
Depending on the camp. Sometimes they had medicines that they begged, borrowed or stole. It'd then be given to the doctors.
So they actually conducted operations?
Oh yeah, of course. They had to. If a man's appendix exploded, you got a knife, you sharpened it into a scalpel.
No anaesthetic?
Not usually, no. Sometimes they could manufacture them, but sometimes it just came down to either doing operations without anaesthetic, or as one medical orderly told me, it came down to the biggest man with the strongest fist.
Wow. So how did the prisoners survive?
A lot of it came down to luck and the extraordinary work of allied medical personnel.
The most famous of those was the great Weary Dunlop. But thousands of the sick and emaciated POWs on the notorious Thai-Burma Railway owe their lives to this man, Ballarat-born Albert Coates.
What kind of man was Coates?
He was a great leader, he was a great doctor, but for the period that he's really known for, which is the Second World War, he was one of the great figures of Japanese captivity for Australians.
Coates' experiences as a medical orderly in World War I inspired him to study medicine between the wars.
He always wanted to avoid as much suffering as possible on his patients because he'd seen such terrible things in the First World War.
So by the time World War II came around, he wasn't a young man?
No, he was a very experienced surgeon. He was already one of Australia's most famous pioneering surgeons. He'd built a large family in Ballarat. He had 5 children.
And yet he wanted to go, even though that would mean leaving his family behind.
He saw it as his duty to go again. And as a doctor, he saw his duty was to protect his men.
In the brutal conditions of the Burma-Thailand Railway, Coates' dedication and skill shone through. The tireless doctor would cut out 70 ulcers in a morning and perform 10 amputations in the afternoon. He was known as much for his humility as his courage.
Why is he so special?
He was a healer, but he was also a military man. So he could speak to other military officers as an officer to officer, which was some other doctors found difficult to do. The fact that he'd also served in the First World War gave him a lot of gravitas to the troops. But he was a small man, but his leadership was legendary.
So he was a small man, but his leadership was legendary?
No, that's not what
Are you
I'm
making
saying.
a point about small men?
No, I'm saying his stature belied his authority, perhaps. Weary Dunlop, for example, was very, very tall.
Weary Dunlop, he's much better known, isn't he, than Coates?
He is, but he survived a lot longer. So he was around during the 80s where interest in POWs was at its peak. I think after Dunlop, Coates is quickly becoming the most recognised name, one of the biggest names from the Second World War, not just from captivity.
Sir Albert Coates has deservedly been given his own place in Ballarat's war pantheon. Not bad for a vertically challenged lad who was initially knocked back by the army because of his height. A little man standing tall. While I'm on the main street, this little man is going in search of some famous Ballarat tucker.
I'm going to tell you a war story while at the same time doing a blind tasting, which, as far as I know, is a first on Australian television. The reason I'm doing it is every time I come over here, Australians start waxing lyrical about a particular brown spread which you put on toast, which you guys say is unique, although as far as I'm concerned, it tastes exactly the same as a very similar brown spread that we have in England, which starts with an M and ends with an Marmite. I think you probably know the one that I mean. So this is a little test to see whether you can distinguish Vegemite from Marmite. Would you mind taking one of each of these? Now, the reason that I'm doing this here is that Vegemite was actually invented by a bloke from Ballarat.
His name was Cyril Callister,
Armed with the science degree, he worked in munitions in England in World War I, and then later as a food technologist. And he came back and he invented Vegemite. But when Vegemite was launched, was it a huge success? No, it wasn't. The sales were desultory. Why? Well, because Marmite had already cornered the market. No one was interested in a new brown spread. But, and this is why it's a war story, what transformed the fortunes of Vegemite was the Second World War. Vegemite was chockers with vitamin B, it was portable, and of course it was a poignant, apparently tasty reminder of home for the fighting lads and lasses overseas. So the army put packs of Vegemite into the kit bag of every soldier, and whoosh, the sales took off. And by the time the war was over, it had become the Australian icon, along with the kangaroo and the wombat. OK, this is the moment of truth. Was the Vegemite the one without the cocktail stick in? No. You sure? Yes. Was the Vegemite the one with the cocktail stick in? Yes. Sorry. You're right! Absolutely. And which do you prefer, the Marmite or the Vegemite?
Vegemite.
A wave of Australian patriotism courses through the room. I'm sticking with the Marmite. See ya. If you're hunting for history, where are you bound to end up? In the pub, because it's there that the best stories are invariably told. And there's nowhere in Ballarat that you get a better story than here at the George Hotel in the Bull Allen Bar. This is what I wanted to show you over here, this picture. It's a photo of an Australian stretcher bearer, a national hero, a Ballarat hero. Hi, guys. Do you drink here? Yeah. So you've passed this a lot of times?
Yeah, a few, yeah.
Who is it?
Mr.
Yeah, go on.
Allen, yeah.
Correct, Mr. Allen. Do you know his story?
Not really.
OK, this is Les Allen, Bull Allen, as he was known. This is New Guinea, Mount Tambu, 1943, and Mount Tambu was occupied by the Japanese, and the Australians and the Americans wanted to get it, so they attacked the mountain, but a bunch of them got pinned down, snipers were taking them out, there were a lot of injuries. This guy, Bull Allen, stretcher bearer, it's down to him to rescue them. You can see how he's carrying somebody off the mountain. Come here a sec. Can you nip up those stairs? Just go to like about halfway round the second turn there. And if you could put your mate over your shoulder. OK, now, see if you can come down, but do be careful. Now, imagine in 1943, Alan wasn't coming down a couple of flights of stairs. This was a sheer mountain with knife-edge peaks and great big drops, and there's all slush and muck that you're trying to negotiate your way through, and you're being fired at. How are you feeling?
Oh.
OK, you can put him down.
Struggling.
It is struggling. I'm not surprised at all, but he didn't just do it once. He went up there and did it again and rescued somebody else, and he went up there, rescued somebody else. By this time, the Yanks at the bottom are laying bets on how many men he'll be able to rescue before he himself is killed. But he wasn't killed. He managed to get every single injured man off the mountain, all 12 of them. And when he finished, he collapsed on the ground in exhaustion.
What a hero.
Amazing bloke, amazing. Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bull's extraordinary deeds earned him 2 honours, a US Silver Star, America's 3rd highest, and a personal letter of thanks from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Not bad for a working-class lad who was abused by his father for years before being abandoned in an orphanage.
I can remember one story he told about his father. They're coming into Ballarat in the gig, which is 2 saplings, a horse and a bag across the back for the kids. Very little kids, so it's probably only about 3. Anyhow, the bag broke on the way in. The kids fell out the gig. The old fella kept on going into Ballarat, realised I wasn't there, come back and gave him a hiding for falling out the gig. So,
that kind of upbringing.
Yeah.
Why do you think he became a stretcher bearer? I mean, a bloke like that, big, massive man, you'd have expected him to be a commando or something.
Yeah, but he was a quiet type of person as well. He wasn't a boisterous, aggressive person. To him, it was a job that he had to do. He was there, he was the person that could do it, so he did it. But probably in his own mind, he probably could have done better. Not that anyone would, but he probably thought, I've left a couple back.
He was always one for looking after his mates, and that was his prime objective. And if his mates got injured, he'd go out and bring them in or treat them on the spot in front of machine gun posts.
Yeah. He was in quite a state when he was discharged, wasn't he?
Oh, he couldn't talk.
He literally couldn't speak?
No, he couldn't speak. I reckon about 6 months, his uncles and aunts taught him power of speech again, a little bit.
Thousands of returning World War I and II soldiers fought the same demons. Happily, the raging bull, who had saved so many of his mates, was finally saved himself.
And I talked to Mum about this, and she said that the main thing that pulled Dad back together was he got married and he had a family. So that was very significant in his life, that he had a family he had to look after and care for.
I'm just going to stay and have a bevy with the Allen boys, because tomorrow is a big day at the roadshow. Ballarat, we want to see gold.
More difficult to digitise something this big.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Hi. Hello. Welcome all you Ballaratians. What a fantastic word that is. Isn't Ballaratians one of the great words of the Australian language? This really is an extraordinary place. It's the only place where all Australia's prisoners of war are recorded. So in there are thousands upon thousands of stories of deprivation, of cruelty, and of heroism, all of them watched over by these glorious obelisks. The fallen one representing the 8,600 Australians who've actually died in captivity. So today we're going to salute and we're going to celebrate. I can't wait to hear all the stories that you're going to tell us and see all the memorabilia that you've brought with you. Thank you very much for coming. Let's get on with the Tour of Duty Roadshow. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for coming.
Great to see you.
Very nice to see you too. This is the man. This is Professor Peter Stanley from the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Yeah. Who is a military historian. He knows just about everything there is to know about World War I and World War II, and a lot about other wars as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
Here in Ballarat today, what are the kind of stories that you're going to be chasing?
Well, obviously ex-POW stories, Tony, but also stories of Victorians in amazing places. Just had a story Robin showed me of a man who goes off to Gallipoli, comes home and marries his nurse.
Oh, isn't that romantic? Find lots more stories like that.
Sure, hope so. Thanks. All right.
Oh, yeah? You got a bell.
Indeed.
A bell with a clapper on it. Last orders, that is, in London. So why have we got a bell?
The story starts with a troop train in 1940, passing through Ararat Station, was stopped.
Where's Ararat?
Just up the road from here, to the west. While it was stopped, the troops souvenired the station master's bell.
So, did you hear that word, souvenired? What a euphemism that is. They nicked it.
Well, yes. The train moved on, and then the station master discovered his bell was missing. So he got on the phone, rang Ballarat, the next station down the line, and said, there so-and-so's have pinched my bell, stop the train and get it back. And that's what they did at Ballarat. They stopped the train, searched it, found the bell. OK, we've got the bell back, sent the train on its way, and only then the Ballarat station master found that his bell was missing.
And what happened to it after that?
Well, it's had quite some travels. The bell is inscribed. It's, this is the bell that called the boys of the 7th Division supply column to meals in Bombay, Palestine, Tobruk and Syria, 1940, 1942.
So it just went with the guys all the way around the theatres of war?
Yeah, and through the siege of Tobruk. Returned in 1942, And the troops returned, they'd only borrowed it, so they returned it to the railways in 1942. The railways had already replaced the bell, so the bell was donated to the Ballarat Museum.
That's beautiful. And this is the Ballarat Station Master?
Ballarat Station Master, yes, with his bell.
Lovely
it's a wonderful story.
Thank you very much. Never nick a bell.
It's hard to get away quietly.
Take a seat, Bill.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Cheers,
Right.
mate. Oh, there's that there.
Now, straight away, Bill, looking at this doll, I know that this is a long tan story.
Long tan story, yes.
That this is a story that we need to bring Tony in. So where's
What
Tony?
are you two up to?
Tony,
Yeah.
this doll is rarer than a Victoria Cross.
What do you mean?
Bill Arkell was at Long Tan in Vietnam.
How are you?
Tell me about Long Tan.
Battle of Long Tan occurred on the 18th of August 1966 in the Long Tan rubber plantation. There was 105 Australians and 3 New Zealanders, and we were up against an enemy force of 2,500.
So what was your contribution that day?
My contribution was that I was a signal with company headquarters in the middle of our company. When the radio operator in Tempertoon, he got shot. The round went through his radio set, causing it to be unserviceable. He came back in. I then took the radio that I had, I took it forward to Tempertoon.
And what you mean is you took it through Vietnamese fire to 10 platoon?
Yeah, silly thing to do, wasn't it?
But a great story, but why is this bizarre lady looking at us while you're telling it?
Bizarre is the word, Tony, because Bill was one of a group of Australians who were to be awarded a Vietnamese decoration, a South Vietnamese decoration. But it didn't happen that way, did it, Bill?
No, it didn't. On the day of the parade, we were ready to march on to receive the decorations, and we were told to hold it. There was a hiccup somewhere along the line. Then when we marched on, we were called forward one by one. When I moved forward to the general to receive the medal, we naturally enough exchanged military courtesies, and then he presented me with a doll.
This is weird. Why did he get a doll and not a medal?
Because the Australian government's policy was that Australian soldiers should not accept decorations from foreign powers. The problem is nobody had told the South Vietnamese that. So at the last moment, dolls were substituted for medals.
Yes.
So you never, ever got your medal?
Eventually, the government released a media statement giving us permission to wear the medals, but we had to go and buy them. So, I mean, that's the way it goes, mate.
It looks as though you all were very amused by the joke, though.
Well, we were. I think we all looked at each other and said the old proverbial, what the hell, you know.
What it means, though, is there were only 6 dolls presented. There are now only 2 in existence. So this is more rare than a VC.
Never trust the generosity of politicians. Nice to meet you, Bill. Great story.
Thanks, Tony.
The Victorian town of Ballarat has gone quiet today, probably because the locals are flocking to the Tour of Duty roadshow at the Australian ex-POWs Memorial.
The Gold Museum have just given me this amazing object, and I want to tell Tony, but he's at the end of the autograph queue.
There you are.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me. Tony, I have to tell you about this amazing object.
Is that a horse's hoof?
It's a horse's hoof. It's the hoof of Ballarat Bob. But the important thing about Ballarat Bob is that it was the horse of Colonel Tom Price.
And who was he?
Colonel Tom Price was one of the great figures of colonial military history in Australia, and he was in the Boer War. The horse carried him through the war, and his men from the Victorian Mounted Rifles were complaining that they were lousy, they had lice. And Colonel Tom Price rounded on them and said, "I'm lousy, the Padre's lousy, Lord Roberts is lousy, and the dear old Queen herself, if she was here, she'd be lousy."
Excellent.
So Tom Price has a certain personality.
This is so bizarre. Was this something that many people did? I mean, when my old dog dies, the last thing I'm going to do is cut her paw off and have it mounted.
Or hang it around your neck.
Yeah.
No, it's quite usual because the man and horse formed quite a strong bond.
Yeah.
And of course, Tom Price wanted to remember Ballarat Bob, who'd carried him through the Boer War. So when he was shot in September 1900, Tom Price had his hoof mounted and used as an inkwell.
Oh, it's an inkwell, I've seen it, yeah.
And it's a great Ballarat story as well.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
long relationship with the Australian Army. Yeah.
Oh, that's how I'll sign my autographs from now on.
Yes.
Yeah, cheers.
Okay.
Next!
I'll get out your way.
Thank you.
So, Joan, what is this book?
This is the book that was sent to me by my friend John Chafee, whom we met during the war years when the Americans were stationed in Ballarat.
Was he an American Marine?
Yes, he was indeed.
Indeed, because the American Marines were here in 1943.
Yes, they
after
were.
the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Yes.
So, to Joan, with my very best wishes, and may you soon be tempting Charles with some of these items. Who's Charles?
My husband. My late husband.
He was your
but
fiancé
he was
at
my
the time?
fiancé at the time.
Right.
Yes, yes, there it is, evidence.
Okay. And more evidence is that sweetheart brooch that you're wearing.
Ah, yes, yes.
Why are you wearing a RAF Wings?
Because my dear husband was a RAF.
Okay.
He also trained in Ballarat.
Now, can I ask, how did your soon-to-be husband and the Americans get on?
They were friends.
Friends, yes. That's how I describe the relationship too. They were friends.
Yes, yes.
So tell me a little bit more about John Chafee. He came back to Ballarat again?
Yes, he did.
The name rings a bell. What did he do back in America?
He was very keen, a keen politician, and he became a senator.
Okay.
And I really feel he would have become not a prime minister, you know.
A president.
President,
Okay.
of course.
You know, the wonderful thing about this story, Joan, is that we talk about these terrible stories of death and suffering, and here's a beautiful story of friendship that's gone on for 50 years.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
It has.
Yeah.
And thank you, Peter.
These little huddles. I always know there's going to be something interesting at the front. Oh, what's this?
This is my mother's wedding frock, Tony.
Well, why are you showing us your mother's wedding frock?
Because she was married at the beginning of the war in '39, and after her 6 other women wore the wedding frock, so 7 women wore the wedding frock.
7 women wore the same wedding frock, not on the same day. Just
No.
Why did 7 women wear the same dress?
I think it was economical reasons, because people didn't have the money in those days. We were at war, and so it was handed on and everyone wore it, which was marvellous, really, I think.
Incredible. There must have been loads of different fittings. The old dress must have gone in and out all the time.
Yes, it's very tiny, so I don't know how they even got in there, really.
She looked very regal, didn't
yes,
she?
and this is my aunt, who also wore the
Oh, wow. Same frock, yeah. Isn't it interesting how when there is such a scarcity of resources in wartime, everyone finds new ways of doing things? I mean, nowadays, you wouldn't dream of wearing the same wedding dress as 6 other people, would you? It's lovely, isn't it? Now, if we had the resources, we'd now cut away to all of you in the same dress.
G'day, Doug. I see you're reading about the Montevideo Maru.
I am indeed, because there's a personal tragedy, not just a national tragedy. This is a family story.
Tell me your family story. Who went down on the Montevideo Maru?
This is Uncle George, who's involved in this terrible incident.
And this terrible incident is that the Montevideo Maru, this Japanese transport, is taking, 1,000 Australian prisoners of war and internees from Rabaul, New Britain to Japan. And it's sunk in July 1942 by an American submarine, by mistake.
Yes.
So George is one of those 1,000 Australian prisoners.
He was. And poor old Auntie Jean finally finds out 1946.
Now, I see you've got a letter there, Doug. What's the letter say?
The letter is the last that the nephews and nieces, my older brothers and sisters, received. So, dear Max, Dawn, Bill, Graham, Barry, Roberts, what a list. It's like calling the roll. I was very pleased to receive all your letters last week. They were quite a treat. Although I can tell you, I was very disappointed they did not come earlier. I see you're busy at school, Bill. 38 marks. Good old Bill. Thanks for the drawing of your cat.
Tell us how the loss of George affected the family.
Well, as I said, I was born after the war, so I don't know Uncle George, but when I read the letter, I know what a delightful human being he was. Every Christmas, every anniversary of his death, I saw Mum cry. I had never seen Mum cry. You didn't. In the 50s, they were powerful people. Adults were the ones that looked after you. And here, for the first time, I saw sadness and despair.
So, what did Jean know about George's death? Do you think she must have dwelt on it, she must have imagined it? What do you think she knew?
I think it was beyond dwelling upon. I think that her response to it was like the people of that time, and that is, you get on with it. But every now and again it would simply cut through.
So she carried that loss, that hurt, that grief in her heart for the rest of her life.
It was just horrific. It was just unbelievable. The heartache of the thing was still there.
Doug, thanks for sharing that story with us.
I think we've had a pretty good afternoon, haven't we? I loved the story of the wedding dress, because I think that reminds me of the sacrifices that people made on the home front, not just actually fighting in the war. And the Larrakin soldiers who nicked the bell, that was rather funny, wasn't it? And the soldiers who were given a little dolly instead of a medal, and Ballarat Bob's hoof. The horse's hoof, I think it should have been called, really. But being surrounded by all these images of the prisoners of war reminds me how difficult it must have been to have been away from home for so long. This is a letter from a guy called Charles Reeks. Well, he says that this is the 4th Christmas that he's been away from Ballarat, and says, I'm sure it's kind of all you people to still remember us over here. One almost forgets what home is like now. Thanks for having us.